Hello and welcome to our panel titled Leveraging Customer Data Ethically to Advance Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. My name is Kelly Cochran. I'm the Deputy Director of FinRegLab. We're a nonprofit research organization focused on the use of data and technology in financial services with a particular focus on the ways that data and technology can potentially reach underserved consumers, small businesses, and other populations. It is often said that what gets measured gets managed. And for diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, there are two very important implications of that maxim. One is to think through how we effectively gather the data necessary to really measure the impact of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives and of financial services and products more generally on the long-term financial health of the customers who receive and use those products and services. The second question is to think through how we protect the trust of those customers, particularly for populations who may have particular concerns about data safety, about usage or privacy considerations. We have two panelists here today to talk through these issues. I'm really excited to hear their thoughts. One is Rob Curtis from Daylight, and the other is Jasmine Thomas from Citi. I'm going to give them a minute to introduce themselves and then do some quick housekeeping before we dig in on the substance. Rob, do you want to start?
Hi, Kelly. Thank you very much for having us today. My name is Rob Curtis. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Daylight. Daylight is the first and only digital banking platform that's designed specifically for the needs of around 30 million LGBT Americans. Happy to go into lots of details on that, but really our job is to help people improve their financial well-being, to give them choices and data that allow them to shop with purpose, and fundamentally come to a place where there's going to be expertise that helps them to understand how their unique financial journeys, and I say journeys rather than one, needs specific kinds of support. So really, really pleased to be here talking about data, which I love. I'm a data geek.
Great. Jasmine?
Hi, I'm Jasmine Thomas. I'm the Director of U.S. Business Partnerships at Citi, where I lead Citi's Action for Racial Equity. It's a 3-year, a little over $1 billion initiative that's designed to invest strategically in initiatives that help close the racial wealth gap across the U.S. And I look forward to discussing more about how we're looking at data with that partnership and project.
Great. Well, obviously we have really interesting initiatives underway and things to talk about, so we'll dive right in. We don't have a very long panel. Just in terms of housekeeping, we're going to start with some questions to both Rob and Jasmine, and then we're going to hopefully save a little time at the end for a few questions. So we ask audience members to go ahead and add questions to the chat so that we can be looking ahead, and we will do our best to save some time. So the first question I wanted to ask to both of you, which is really just to if you could describe how your organizations are using data and how that's connected to your particular focus on DEI or on reaching underserved populations more generally. Jasmine, maybe we can start with you on this question.
Sure. Thank you, Kelly. And again, it's a pleasure to join you all and talk about our work at Citi. We've enjoyed more than a decade of partnership with Financial Health Network and Emerge, so congratulations on just another great lineup. So as I mentioned, I lead Citi's Action for Racial Equity, which we launched last September. So rather than just, commit grant dollars, we actually wanted to lead with our core capabilities. So we deployed 2 parallel strategies, and I'm going to talk to you about just one of them. And that's really the analytic capabilities of Citi. Particularly we leveraged the Independent Global Economic Research Group. And really, they took a close look at data, and the Citi GPS report, which was launched last September, made a clear, compelling economic case for closing the racial wealth gap and focusing on equity. And specifically, what it taught us was that, there's some more of the same has consequences when we look at not addressing inequity. And specifically, one of the biggest kind of data points that came out of it, actually two, was that if the U.S. had closed racial wealth gaps in America in the areas of wages, housing, education, and investments in small business and capital, if we did that 20 years ago to close it, an additional $16 trillion could have been added to the economy. That was just 20 years ago. But if we started today, another $5 trillion could be added. So that's pretty compelling for us as a bank and a financial services institution to take a closer look at where we can add value and lead as an institution. And really, the data really suggested that there was no zero-sum narrative when it comes to looking at financial inclusion and the racial wealth gap, but that there was an opportunity for us to lead. And it moved us and hopefully other institutions that are capital investors to look beyond the social case and the moral case to really focus on the economic business case. And I'll stop there to give Rob a chance to chime in.
Thank you. I think that was very, very comprehensive. And I think probably the best place for us to start is to talk about the LGBT community as a whole. The reason Daylight exists is because people think we're a single group. And many of y'all will be thinking about the financial lives of LGBT folks with shorthands like 2 incomes, no kids, lots of disposable income. And I think one of the things that we know is that, yes, there are lots of two-parent homes with, two adult homes with no children. That group definitely exists. They're probably white folk, they're probably men, they probably live on one of 2 or 3 coastal cities. At the other end of the spectrum, 20% of queer people of color are unbanked or underbanked. And so the first thing about data that we want to get everyone on the same page about is that there is a complete lack of LGBT data at a macro level that describes the needs of our community. And why that's important is because incumbent banks comes to this time of year, it's Pride, we're really excited to show our support for the community. Y'all don't know very much about us. And so what we get is lots of rainbows on stuff. Love a rainbow doesn't actually help me close the LGBT wealth gap. And so the first way that we use data is we're engaging with a number of corporate partners and the Center for LGBT Evidence-Based Applied Research, CLEAR, to do the most comprehensive study on LGBT money that's ever existed in the US. Because the first thing we need to do is to understand the community that we're serving. Daylight exists because y'all don't understand us well enough, and that means that you're not able to serve us well enough. Because we aren't all the same. We have incredibly wide ranges of financial outcomes. We don't quite reach the heights that you all reach, but we certainly plumb the depths that you do. So how do we build upon a real lack of an evidence-based environment in which to build financial inclusion products? We ask our customers, and we ask questions that y'all probably wouldn't think are natural in a banking environment. And I'm going to get really personal. I'm going to share 3 pieces about myself that will tell you a little bit about how Daylight can serve me. I'm a gay man. I'm a parent. I'm a HIV positive person. All 3 of those things are really important to know to serve me well enough. My healthcare needs need to be recognized and funded. So my status as a HIV positive person, which is considered to be a protected class, is important for us to understand. The fact that I'm a gay man means I'm a protected class again. Very important for us to understand. The fact that I'm a parent is really important too. And so really how we're trying to turn banking on its head at Daylight is to treat the LGBT people with the respect that we give the rest of the community, which is detailed micro-segmentation of LGBT people based on their attitudes, their behaviors, their financial status, as well as things like their identity and their goals. And so our ethos to Daylight is we have an obligation as a financial system to understand more about our community. And so we're relatively early in our journey, but we're going to be using all of that kind of data in order to provide the best services. I noticed somebody asked in the chat room whether we're supporting people with disabilities. LGBT folks are 3 to 5 times more likely to suffer from mental health conditions. That means our healthcare costs are different. And so actually when you describe supporting what feels like a narrow community, actually you bring in factors that spread across the entire population in the States. But we take that seriously because the existing segmentations just don't apply. So really the short answer is we're learning as much about our customers as we can. We're treating that incredibly carefully because as protected classes, safety for us means things like don't out somebody, don't dead name somebody, don't make sure your data is available to a Russian airport because we don't know what the impact of our data could have outside of our own walled garden. So we use a really wide variety of data to be able to serve the unique needs of our community.
Thanks. Rob, real quickly, I wanted to follow up a little bit on the way that you were thinking about data as a startup. I mean, obviously, Citi is at the other end of the spectrum, and I'd love to want to ask Jasmine kind of a related question too. But starting with you as a startup, how does that kind of influence your thinking about data collection, data use, and those kinds of concerns?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. Every startup has really a series of growth spurts, and we have to get to the next one, otherwise we don't survive. So we are about to close our seed round sometime this week, which is great. That gives us 12 to 18 months to focus on getting to product market fit. And so what that means is that we've built a product that is viable, usable, and desirable by our community. So the data we use really actively is going to range from analytical data on how people are using the product. Specific demographic data helps us to target the groups that we're going to go after first, because Rome wasn't built in a day and neither is any startup. So the ability to start small and be focused is really important. And so we look at the combination of who the person is, what their unique personal situation tells us about their banking needs, what their health situation might tell us about their banking needs. And then once we have those informations, we might use that to, say, target a group. In our example, we're targeted values-based LGBT folks, because actually a lot of people want to spend with purpose but don't know how. But once we get into our product, we look at all of the analytical data, who does what, by what segment, and so on. That's the stuff that allows us as an early stage startup to have a product that works really well. I think the main thing we think about two things. We need that data to help us to survive. If we don't get to Series A, we've helped nobody. And we've got a mission that is really important to close the LGBT wealth gap and create a more equitable system. And that's really front and center of how we think about how we do work. But the second thing that is a must-have at the top of every time we talk about data is how do we keep our customers safe? Because safety for us is really important. LGBT people retire in places that are 40% more expensive because it's safer for us. We live in cities because it's safer for us. And so safety has to be part of the equation at every step of the way. Now, I was very vulnerable in sharing multiple examples of how I'm a protected class, but I wanted to do that to make this real. If my health status got out, that could be a real barrier for me. If my LGBT status, that could be a real barrier for me if that got out. But my co-founder Billy is a trans woman, and I think we need to understand for members of our own community how we don't even get to control all of the data that is being held about us. Because for a trans woman who is able to update their identity record to get their FICO score changed, we then provide a comprehensive credit score to landlords, to employers that out those people as trans folk. And so we have to think not only, and sadly, not everyone wants to let trans folk live in their homes, and not everyone wants to give trans folk their jobs. It's wrong, but it is the nature of the secondary consequences of data for us. So we have to think about not only what is necessary for keeping our business alive, what is necessary to provide a great service for our customers, what's necessary to keep them safe, but we also have to think about the secondary and tertiary uses of that data, because this is a very leaky financial services system that we operate in, and the consequences on communities like ours can be really, really, can be devastating. So we take this stuff really, really seriously just because we have to. It's an important part of our brand.
Thanks. Jasmine, with regard to the Action for Racial Equity initiative, how are you thinking about measurement of impact in that space? That's a really large initiative, and it seems like there are a lot of moving pieces there.
There are a ton of moving pieces, and I appreciate that. And Rob, I appreciate you raising the intersectionality point, which we often don't raise when it comes to financial inclusion, that we carry multiple identities, and those identities influence our access, our level of support, engagement, as well as oftentimes, as you just said, wealth. So as I mentioned early on in my remarks, we took the first approach of looking at data, of the macro data and the data and expertise that we had internally. The second thing that we did was really take a look at our business capabilities as investors. So we mobilized the business functions and teams across the investment bank and the consumer bank to look and embed initiatives within portfolios, so nothing siloed. So that means it's easy for us to track and measure over time. And a lot of my time is working daily with the business leaders to identify how we can streamline approaches, how we can accelerate access points, or figure out what new tools we need to put in place to make it more accessible for consumers. So really quickly, we realized it wasn't just about getting these investments up and going, but really about changing our mindsets about how we engage consumers and realizing how we do things really mattered and had an impact on the outside of things. So as I shared in the consumer bank, we really shored up programs and platforms to ensure that consumers improve either access to credit, scoring, or mortgage access. And in our update in April, we actually outlined a few of what those initiatives look like. We're also partnering closely with minority deposit-taking institutions to help them generate revenue, but also strengthen their ability to reach and serve consumers, oftentimes in places where we don't have a retail presence or where we're not available. So for us, it's more of a systemic, how do we build the field and leverage our core capabilities to do so? And that requires data and technology to do so. That third piece of that is also, engaging with private and public collaborations like the OCC's Project Reach. And that is where data and understanding what consumer insights and needs are is front and center for that initiative. And we hope further support regulatory support. And I know Daylight's probably looking at some of the issues now and the drivers around the policy lens to protecting and looking at consumer data. And then lastly, to your point, we do have to be proactive about being accountable. We do have to look at ourselves, our own internal policies. And that really is a commitment that wasn't just a nice to do, but it's the fourth pillar of our entire initiative. And for us, it really was, how do we embed what we believe are anti-racist or not focused on a particular consumer group, but those things that are universal, those things that align with our brand, our thought leadership, and how we believe access should be available and engaging for all. It is early days, so September to June 9th, it still feels new. What's exciting that there's more initiatives coming, but what also is kind of keeping us focused on a North Star is this notion that we do have to track and look at those investments very closely and do so in partnership to really understand the economic value of the investments we made besides the dollar amounts that we committed.
Okay, thank you. There's so much to cover here, and I do want to save a little time at the end. I guess before we turn to the audience questions, maybe each of you could share one lesson learned so far in your journeys as you're kind of thinking about these questions. And if someone is coming to you and thinking about launching their own DEI initiative, or focus on a particular customer demographic, what's an important top of mind consideration to suggest to those folks?
I would say, if I could, first, implementation feasibility. I think everybody sees large banks and says, of course you could do this. But I think at the end of the day, it's important to right size based on the size of your institution and the scale and the scope by which you all want to lead. The other thing is, what does it cost for us to really do it? Both indirect costs, staffing costs. This is my full-time job. It is a constant but exciting and a growth opportunity for all of us, and we're only learning that there's nothing but possibilities in the work that we're doing. Differentiation is another key one. At the end of the day, what's unique about your institution that you want to leverage? Don't try to run anybody else's race. How do you run your own on some of these topics? Focus on the consumer groups or the segments that you're most focused on or proud about or think you can really make an impact. And also there's a difference between scale and innovation. Sometimes it works to just go faster and bigger as opposed to doing something new. And I think being cautious about those two things are key.
Great. Rob?
Yeah, I think you'll notice that Daylight is part of a cohort of neobanks that are focusing on individual communities that have been underserved by large financial institutions. And I think one thing that we've learned, and that I touched upon earlier, but that I'm noticing each of my counterparts in those businesses is doing, is going deeper than most folks would in understanding the community that you're trying to serve. When I said before the LGBT community isn't a monolithic group, I gave you 2 examples of people at extreme ends, and then I gave you 3 different pieces of data that inform how I might need a product developed. And I'd say there's one lesson learned, and you want to treat a customer segment seriously. Don't skimp on sampling, don't skimp on research, learn about them. Don't try and shoehorn them into existing personas, existing finance journeys, because here's the reality. If you do that to queer folk, you won't pick up co-parents, you won't pick up non-monogamy. You may have a judgment about whether those things are right. Those are realities now. The world has changed very fast. And so I think take nothing for granted, do the homework, talk to the customers, understand their lives, because when you do that, you can create superior products. And very much we started this exercise because we think we can do that faster and better than anybody else. But we do believe that a second role that I have is educating others about how they can do better by our community through campaigns like Call Me By My Name, which calls on greater trans inclusion, which is just something that nobody really thought about. And I think very much DE&I initiatives are really important, but the thing to remember is we have been here the whole time. All of these communities have been living great financial lives, whether they've been a focused area or not. So rather than treat them as new and interesting things to discover, figure out what you haven't understood about people that have been on your books for a long time would be my top piece of advice.
Okay, thanks. We only have a minute or two left for questions, and I'm going to try and do a little combination action. Rob, a couple of things. One is, one of the questions was about, are there kind of best practices that you're able to share with social services providers, and if those are evident yet. But the other question is, I wanted to return to your focus on kind of the safety question and how we do that. Now, obviously, there are regulatory constraints in the U.S., particularly in the lending context, about collecting certain types of data. In some cases, it's mandated to collect. In some cases, it's generally prohibited. Obviously, we need to think through the regulatory requirements that apply. But some of this is not about regulatory. It's more about thinking more deeply about customer trust and relationship building. And I just want to talk briefly, if you could, about what are some of the practices that you're really focused on to both safeguard the data, but also communicate with your customers about what you're doing to safeguard the data. So, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I think we're pretty early on. I mean, if you use my example of a protected class with another protected class, talking about HIV, talking about parenting, there's a lot of complexity there to compliance. So I'm going to put that to a side now because we recognize that is going to be new. It's going to have a lot of work to be able to navigate through that in a compliant way. What instead I'll talk about is somebody who's trans. We have a number of golden rules, and one of them is never dead name anybody. Now, for those of you that don't understand what that means, most trans people will adopt a chosen name that reflects their the gender that they are. The dead name is considered something that is in bad taste to reference and is deeply offensive. So our golden rule of never dead name anybody, we don't just take that on the card. We offer cards with whatever name you'd like. That has to extend to CRMs. That has to extend to the push notifications, your credit checking systems. And so I think we think of data as from a customer experience lens, because there is physical safety, there's financial safety, and there is emotional safety. And dead naming somebody, there is no excuse for it. There is zero excuse for anybody on this call to have a platform that dead names a trans person, because trans people represent 0.5 to 1% of the population. They've been here the whole time. We just haven't caught up. And so the way we like to think about data is what gives the dignity to the customer, what treats them with the respect they're due, and how do we ensure their physical safety? Because actually, for a trans person of color, their life expectancy is closer to 35 than 45. So these things are lifesavers for our community. They're deeply important. And so we appoint people that are responsible for that. I have a head of no dead naming. I have a head of never outing somebody. And those are roles that are identified in our organization in order to make sure that there's a clear line of accountability and that we're delivering not just on what regulatory standards are, which go a long way but don't go far enough, otherwise we wouldn't be dead naming people at all. So we see regulatory as the baseline, and we have to then build on top of it in order to serve our customers with safety, with dignity, and with respect.
Can I just say that Citi has the same exact policy in the sense that we launched True Name last year in June to really, to make sure that our commitment and our values to identifying people as they want to be named was very critical and central to that work. So absolutely, to what Rob said, I think dead naming is, at Citi, definitely something that we consider, and thank God we've got something in place to acknowledge that and to respect the clients that we have.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I think we are just about out of time. Rob, were there any kind of best practices that you wanted to share with social service providers, or is that something we should come back to you at the next conference about?
I think that's probably for the next conference, given the amount of time that we've got, but happy to have somebody share that question by email, and I'd be happy to see if I can respond.
Fabulous. Well, it's just been such an honor to talk to you all today. So many interesting questions. I mean, I think one of the things that struck us as we've been working in this space is there are always concerns about data and customer protection for any population. Consumers have such a complicated environment to navigate today in terms of who has their data, what the data is used for. And I think especially when it comes to secondary, uses, really thinking through what information you need for what purposes, can you minimize that to accomplish your purpose and measure your impact while, protecting the security and various other kinds of safety and privacy considerations. So it's so helpful to talk to both of you about this. And thanks to our audience for joining us and to Financial Health Network for organizing this panel. It's been a great conversation and really enjoyed talking. So
Thank you. Real pleasure.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate the time.